In this video, we are continuing our Death Cultures Around the World series and we're heading to Romania. Most people don't know much about this country, but I assure you it's a lot more than simply an ex-Soviet country and a posting for Dracula. Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk Romanian death culture. First up, let's put it on the map. Romania is located in the eastern side of Europe, its capital is Bucharest, and geographically it's a fairly average sized country. It has a population of just over 19 million with a life expectancy of 70 years for men and 78 years for women, which is about 4 years less than the European average. The most common cause of death, like many countries around the world today, is by far heart disease and stroke. And by many measures, Romania is a very religious country, with 85% identifying as Christian, specifically 73% identifying as Romanian Orthodox Christians. It is said that almost all ethnic Romanians embrace Orthodoxy as an element of national belonging, even if they do not practice the religion regularly. However, folk traditions are also an extremely important part of Romanian culture, and obviously that's going to be important for what we're going to talk about next. Keep in mind, like many post-Soviet countries, Romania has undergone quite a cultural shift in the past few decades. So while traditions, gender roles and economics are still rather traditional and conservative compared with Western European countries, there has still been a very solid shift in loosening the holds of these ideas as well. Aging and dying. The role of the family in aged care continues to be very important for most Romanians, especially for the older generation and those living in rural areas. Elders are highly respected in Romanian culture, and it is still very common for grandparents to live with their family. Traditionally, all members of the family are expected to share the responsibilities of looking after their elderly family members in their old age, regardless of the person's individual life circumstances. The concept of putting a relative into an aged care home is unfathomable for most people. Palliative care, as used for dying, is relatively new in Romania. While there has been a non-profit palliative care organisation in the country since 1992 running off donations, a palliative care subspecialty for doctors was only recognised in the early 2000s. And a multidisciplinary master's degree program has only been available at Transylvania University since 2010, when the first palliative care academic position was established. Luckily, nowadays nursing education includes mandatory palliative care modules in nursing schools, and there are a number of inpatient and outpatient hospice services in the country. But with an ageing population and a lot of the younger generations moving abroad to find work, these services are about to be really put to the test in terms of their functionality, but also as in a change to their culture. Whereas just a decade ago, putting a dying parent in hospice care would have been unthinkable and disrespectful. When it comes to dying, folklore and Christianity play a big part. There are several superstitions from different parts of the country that are said to indicate when a death is near, including a mirror or furniture breaking, animal making unusual sounds, a dog howling with its head down and digging outside a sick person's home, a sick person constantly staring at their nails or at the wall, or an owl hooting, since owls are seen as death symbols. When someone is close to death, a candle is placed at their head so that they're able to see their way while they journey into the afterlife. And a priest is brought in to administer the sacrament of holy unction, also known as anointing of the sick. In order to facilitate an easy passage into the afterlife for the deceased, any doors in the home are left unlocked and mirrors are covered in black cloth so the deceased spirit doesn't get lost in them and start haunting the living. Additionally, animals should be shooed away so that the deceased spirit doesn't enter their body. There are many rituals that must be performed, and it is significant that folklore traditions are followed and respected, because Romanians believe that they should do as much as they possibly can to help their deceased loved one get to heaven as easily as possible. Many believe, particularly those in rural areas, that if these traditions are not completed, it could lead to the deceased person becoming restless and bother the living. And whilst the myth of vampires and zombies might have originated in Romania, exhumations do take place if a person believes the deceased person hasn't been fully laid to rest. This is rare nowadays, but it is something we'll come back to a bit later. After death. Once someone has been declared dead, there is usually a wake lasting 2 nights. During the days, the family and friends watch over and protect the deceased. The night wakes are parties to keep the guests awake and to celebrate with the deceased one last time. Professional performers or priests lead prayers to pay respect to the deceased and prevent any hauntings by the spirit. Food is a big deal in Romanian culture, so of course it plays a big part in mourning traditions as well. Before the funeral, relatives make some traditional Romanian funeral foods, including a sweetbread. They use this bread to make a decorated fruit tree branch that represents the tree of life. It also symbolises the passage from the current world to the next. They also make a dish with wheat grains that represents the sins of the dead. As far as the funeral goes, it is vital that the deceased enter the church first before anyone else. Male mourners may be given a handkerchief as homage, which is expected to be kept and taken home after the funeral service. And a candle is usually given to all mourners entering the funeral service venue. Mourners usually bring a flower wreath, which they lay beside the coffin, which is usually open. The funeral service is often sombre, with singing and many stories being told. In decades past, in certain areas, a funeral service would be filled with mourners wearing masks and costumes and celebrating the deceased's life with music and dancing. In other parts of the country, it was common to have professional mourners who would wail at the head of the coffin to show the pain and grief of all the mourners. Before burial, there may be a changing of the deceased's clothes. The deceased's burial clothing depends on their age. The elderly will usually choose their clothing ahead of time, while young unmarried people will wear wedding clothes. Romanians believe babies turn into angels, so they cut their shirts so they can spread their wings to fly. By all accounts, modern Romanian funeral culture is a tad more subdued nowadays, but it still retains much of its old traditions. Most Romanians are buried according to Orthodox tradition. Cremation is legal, but there are only 2 cremation facilities in the country, located only in Bucharest and Oradea. And here are some other interesting Romanian death facts. Etiquette. If you're ever invited to attend a Romanian funeral, a heads up that you must not wear red, as it's the equivalent to giving the deceased the middle finger. Not good. Also, an even number of flowers in a bouquet is associated with funerals. So if you're ever thinking of giving flowers to your Romanian date or perhaps a co-worker for their birthday, make sure they are odd-numbered. Dracula. While most of us think of Dracula as a fictional vampire character, the Romanian concept of Dracula is very different from the Western narrative and has nothing to do with vampires. Vlad III Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler, is a real historical figure and national hero in Romanian history, famous for how he disposed of his enemies, and he is really interesting to read about. On another note, digging up the dead because they are restless, as we said earlier, is not something specific to Romania either. Because death and decomposition weren't fully understood back in the day, its appearance was explained as the dead coming back to life, and not in a good way. Some people now still believe this to be true due to lack of education, particularly in rural areas. And I've been meaning to do a video on how this whole vampire myth came about, because I find it fascinating, and I'm sure I'll get around to it eventually. So, not all vampires are Dracula, and not all Draculas are vampires. Profound, I know. But yeah, don't be talking to Romanian people about some fictional character. The real dude was substantially scarier anyways. The Mary Cemetery. So you've probably seen pictures of this cemetery around online. Now, not all cemeteries in Romania look like this, unfortunately, but this cemetery is located in the town of Sapanta. Now, these tombstones are lovely, no question, but the fun is more than that. While in many countries, people won't hear anything bad said about the dead, not so here. Over 800 wooden crosses bear the life stories, dirty details, and final moments of the bodies that they mark. Displayed in bright, cheery pictures and marked with limericks are the stories of almost everyone who has died in the town. There are illustrated crosses depicting soldiers being beheaded and a townsperson being hit by a truck. The epigraphs reveal a surprising level of truth, and when translated, one said, "Underneath this heavy cross lies my mother-in-law poor. Try not to wake her up, for if she comes back home, she'll bite my head off." Another one reads, "He loved horses. One more thing he loved very much, to sit at a table in a bar next to someone else's wife." So if you ever do visit the cemetery, your experience will be much juicier if you take a translation app that works really well. Romanian culture is deep and fascinating, and unlike many other countries, they have held on to their culture despite the crap that their country has gone through throughout its history. And with that, where shall we go next? Let us know in the comments. And with that, go talk death.